Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today I want to do something that I've done already on this channel, and that is make a bassline tutorial. The reason why I'm making this video is kind of like a complement video to the main kick and bass guide that I released a couple months ago. In that video I explained everything about the theory, and in this video I just quickly want to run through a patch and show you some of the basic processing that I like to use on my kick and bass. So this is the example project. This is just the start of an idea that I started working on. In particular, this is a bit more of a groovy project, and it has a more progressive style bassline in the first part. And then it has a rolling bassline in the second part. Now, as you can see, it's the same patch and there's a little bit of trickery involved with making them work for both sides. To be honest, I'm not 100% happy with the sound of the rolling bassline right now, but I do like the progressive bass quite a lot, so I think I'll keep it like this. And maybe I'll redo the bassline with a different patch, because right now, as I said, they're using the exact same patch. So starting off with the kick, let's have a look at that. It is basically just a kick sample. This is my projector kick number 8, and this is from my Quality Kicks Volume 1 sample pack right here. So this one here. You can see that this is part of my favorite drum collection, so I use it all the time actually. As I said, a little bit of EQing, it does make quite a bit of difference, especially in the click. I really had to shape the click to fit the track. But that's basically everything there is to the kick. It is in a group where I apply my filtering and volume if I need to. And maybe later on in the production phase, I'll make copies of the kick in that same group where I have individual tracks for kicks in fills, kicks that are in reverse, and kicks that sit in the build-up, so that I have more control over how they sound. So that's everything that there is to the kick. It's just a sample with some effects on it, some basic EQing and some filtering for transitions. And now going into the bassline, you can see that this is just a preset from my recent preset pack. The only thing that I have tweaked in this case is the macros, but I quickly want to run down through this patch here because it is actually quite a complicated patch. I did a video on it before, in which I explain in more detail how the patch actually works. But for now I'm going to do a quick rundown of it, then I'm going to talk about the effects that are on this bassline, and then I'll recreate this patch from scratch in Serum, so that you can follow along and also remake it for your own productions. Now this is the preset that we'll be working up towards the end of the video. I'm going to leave this presets up for my patrons. So if you want to grab this, just head over to my Patreon page and you'll be able to get it. But of course you do have to keep watching the video as I'll explain how to make it, how it works, and how the processing on it works. So let's first cover the effects, and the reason why I want to cover the effects first is because they have a drastic impact on the sound of the bassline. As you can hear, without them, the bassline sounds completely different. With the effects, it feels a lot deeper and a lot better defined. Now I'm just going to go through each of the effects and turn it on so that you can hear what it does. First is M stereo spread for some basic stereo generation. I like the stereo generator very much for its tone and also the capability of high passing the effect. You just need to spend some time with the bands, the focus and the saturation to determine the exact tone that you want, and then you can dial in the amount right here. The next up is the newest tool that I have in my suite when it comes to bass creation, and that is Transgressor 2. This is an excellent EQ which splits up the signal into transient and the sustain part of the sound. And what I found is that ducking the higher frequencies as well as like 500 Hz in the sustain of the bassline while accentuating the click a little bit more and the transient can sound really nice, especially if you start playing with the release time here, because this has a massive influence on when these two kind of cross over, when it stops being a transient and when it starts to become part of the sustain. And to be honest, all of this stuff on the right side, I don't really touch it. I just trust that this is set up properly for what I want to do with it, and usually that is the case. Next up is some overall EQing to define the tone a little bit more, bring some more attention to the higher frequencies while removing some of the mid-range. So with Transgressor, the sound changes a lot. Notice how we get much more definition in the lower frequencies this way. And then we have an extra bit of EQ to accentuate that even more by removing some of the mid-range and accentuating the click a little bit more. This is a cool trick that I'm doing where I'm going into a saturation unit and I'm removing some of the frequencies so that they have less influence on the saturation. Then I also have the Shadow Hill mastering compressor because I really like the gluing that it does and it nicely accentuates the bottom end. And then I kind of do the inverse EQ in some parts here. These lower are kind of like the inverse of these two here. They're not exact, obviously this is set by ear and not precisely to mirror the other band. But what this does is it takes some weight away from these frequencies and brings the frequencies back in after the saturation happens. So you still restore the frequency content that was originally there. It just doesn't saturate as much. So all of these together, I kind of have to play them all together on and off because they're all set up together. And all of the effects kind of depend on each other. So really the only way to A/B this is with all of it on and all of it off. Notice that it's a very, very small change. It mainly changes the mid-range in my opinion. And it just defines the sub as well a little bit stronger with the way that this Shadow Hills mastering compressor is gluing everything together. So the patch is pretty difficult to explain. There's a lot of moving parts to it. It's not your default kind of baseline preset. What essentially is happening is that I'm controlling everything with LFOs here. Normally what you would do is you would use your envelopes here and then you would need to calculate decay times. I don't like to do that, so I set this to 1/16 notes and then I can assign it to the filter, or I can assign it to the volume, or I can assign it to the other volume. And basically this allows me to not have to worry about calculations of timings. So as you can see, there's 5 LFOs in use and all of them have one parameter that they're controlling. So each shape is really meant for like one parameter in particular. The first shape, this one right here, is for the filter envelope. So this is assigned to the filter cutoff just like this. Then we have one for the sub oscillator. I'm using oscillator B with a knee trick to generate the sub bass, which means that this waveform here has no sub bass in it. So you can see it has the first harmonic removed. And what this is it's a wavetable from my wavetables pack. So I can go into saw waves here in my wavetables pack and just check this freeform phase saw processing normalized. And then all I have to do is go to process and then right here, remove fundamental high pass filter. This is not exactly like a high pass filter because it doesn't shift the phase around like a high pass filter would do. It just removes that lower bin here. But anyway, this means that we now have a processed saw wave without a fundamental frequency, which we can then replace with a normal sine wave in here. If you don't have my wavetable pack and you want still something similar, what you can do is maybe go into Mind B's wavetable pack. If you have that one, he also has these processed looking saw waves and you just high pass filter it. And now this works with this setup. Alternatively, there's also the IAMmersive kick waveform, which also does a similar thing in that it's this processed phased waveform. And again, process, remove fundamental, and now you have a wavetable that you can work with. So as I said, this second oscillator, oscillator B here, is generating a sub bass, but we can see that it's completely silent right now. That's because I'm actually loading a wavetable with 2 frames here. One is a perfect sine wave and one is perfect silence. And then this allows me to basically do 2 volume modulations at the same time. So you have our first volume modulation here on the level, which you can see is this LFO2 set to 16 notes. And then the next one, which is interesting, is this LFO5 here, which is set to a beat. What this will do is it will make sure that the sub bass only plays in the offbeat. What that means, if we look at our kick and bass, is that the kick provides the sub bass here and the bass line provides the sub bass here. And what this means is with the kicks that I have, with the kicks that I tend to use, I don't have to phase align anything. And as you can imagine, that's massive benefits because phase aligning everything just takes a little bit of time. And in this case, I don't have to do that. Anyway, back to the patch. The third LFO is for this level of the first waveform here. So this way we also have individual level control over everything above the first harmonic. And then we have control over the level of the harmonic. And as you can see, this is kind of like slid back a little bit. This is part of the patch. What essentially the idea is behind this patch is that the sub bass comes in later. That was the initial reason why I removed the sub bass. And only after that I thought of this method as well so that I don't have to phase align anything. But anyway, this means that we get that feeling that you get from a very processed bassline of the sub bass being kind of delayed by all of the phasing. But in reality, it's just turning up late during synthesis. It's just delayed a little bit and then only turns up after a while. Now the last LFO is for another final trick that I have here where I'm using the X shaper to generate silence. As you can see, this is fully open. This just lets the sound through. If you close it all the way, you get silence. And then I'm using the mix to just control the volume. What this means is if the modulation is all the way up, the mix will be all the way down, and so the signal will be let through. And then at the end of the note, it just cuts off any remaining signal that might still be there. There's a little bit of post-ringing coming in from these filters that I'm doing with the EQ here. There's a little bit of post-ringing coming from the filter right here. It is normally negligible, but I always like to stay a little bit safer. And since I already have the processing in here, if I make sure that it goes to silence and that there's no bleeding into the next bass note, then as a bonus, I don't have to resample this bass either in order to make sure that it's clean. So as you can imagine, this is a very nice patch to have because it's just easy to drop it on as a preset, tweak a few of the parameters, tweak a few of the macros. When it comes to the macros of this patch, they do something very particular. In this case, as you can see, it changes the wavetail position. Now with the original waveform, that also works the same way as it does for the IAMmersive kick waveform, in that it moves around the kind of amount of phasing that it has. So in the beginning, you can see there's not a lot of phasing happening. Usually for processing, we do want a little bit. So I left a minimum value roughly around here. And then it's just up in the modulation up until a point where it becomes unusable. Even here, I would say this is pretty much the highest that you want to go with the phasing and the processing that you have. Anything above this becomes almost like metallic sounding and it doesn't really sound natural anymore. So for the preset and for this patch and whenever I'm using it on my own, I just have this range here and I've set it up with a macro so that I can easily tweak this. I also have this closer parameter here. This is controlling some of the parameters of the macro. This is controlling some of the curves of the LFO that is controlling the filter cutoff. As you can see, there's 3 over here. Number 1 is right here. For some reason, I cannot select that one. But you can see number 2 and 3 are over here, and this is the first one. And what this essentially does is, as the name suggests, it closes the filter more and more the higher this goes up, and it just makes the bassline a lot more clickier and a lot more snappier. Sometimes you want to go for more open bass sound, and sometimes you want to go for more closed bass sound, and this is a perfect macro to be able to dial that in. Next up is the sub-titer macro here. This just makes it so that the sub-bass comes in earlier. And it's just my main control for the sub-bass effect that I talked about before, where we have this delayed sub-bass that you'll also see in normally processed kick and bass sounds, which instead of a wavetable use multiple rounds of multiband processing. Finally is the note length. This is actually fairly important for the pattern that we're playing here, but in this case it allows you to change between a 16 note all the way to a quarter note and back again with all of the variations with triplets in between. So it's easy to adapt the bassline to maybe a triplet pattern or a different pattern if you have something else in mind than just your standard rolling bassline. And that is one of the things that I'm doing in here. As you can see, if I go into the pattern, every other beat we have an 8th note here, an offbeat 8th note. I'm just turning up the note length right on top of that bass note here to make sure that for this whole part, the bass note actually plays. Now, as you can imagine, this is quite a nice patch to have. It means that I can just load up the patch, tweak a few of the macros, and then continue with more important things. And usually with the way that I work, I first write some of the context of the track, so some of the other things like this. So when I'm listening to the kick and bass in the track, I can make judgment on how this sounds with some synths already in place. And of course, these synths may still change in the production, the bassline may change in the production, and also the kick may change in the production. But usually around this time when it comes to the processing, I like to let it to the rest. I like to just work with the bassline and work with the kick that I have. And when the production is finally over and I go into the mixing stage, I'll spend another round kind of tweaking up the bassline a little bit, making it sound a little bit more like I want to. Because obviously when I redo the whole mix of the track, when I re-import and reaper and just basically set up the volumes again, set up all of the effects that I need, and do all of the mixing things that you would normally do at the end of a production, I will definitely want to make some changes to the kick and bass to work in the new mix. Anyway, now let's look at making a patch just like this from scratch. I'm going to assume that you have the same wavetable as me, that you have the saw wave processing over here, this one. And as we said before, the first thing that we want is we want there to be no fundamental, so we will remove that and close out of here. Now we have our wavetable set up, and we can define a starting position. Let's do that like this, and define an end position. Now let's turn on the filter. I like to go with 18 dB per octave, and I like to have no resonance on there. Set this to around 100 Hz here, and now we can set up the shape that we want. Let's set this to envelope. Make sure that you keep that on envelope always. I like to add an extra point, so I have 2 curves that I can control, and then I'll make a shape somewhat like this. Let's make it a little bit more open so that we can emulate that closer macro that we also had. We'll set up points like this to the X and to the Y here, and then we go into the matrix. Go down like this, like that, and then like that. Maybe these can go up a little bit more. Just some fine tuning happening here. One of the things that I forgot is to set the phase all the way here. Turn off the randomness, set the phase right before it. You want to go a few degrees before your click because there's a little bit of attack to the sound. In fact, we can lower this attack a little bit because we don't need it anyway, because we know that we're starting very close from 0. So we're not going to get any clicks there. Now we can set up the volume envelope for this oscillator. Let's just use Adafruit tool for that. And again, we have to set it to envelope mode, 16 note. And we'll go like this. We'll make a shape like that. I like my basslines to be velocity sensitive, so I'll immediately go in here and set it to velocity. If I can find it, there we are. Now we'll do the sub bass. What we essentially need is a empty waveform and then a sine wave in here, which we'll just do like that. And then gain stage properly like this. We're going to morph crossfade here. And then we're going to go out and we have our volume control here in the wavetable position, which means that we can make our shape. The way that I like to do it is like this. Something like that will be okay. And this just goes here. We'll lower it a little bit. And then we'll again use velocity sensitivity here. This is the reason why you need the separate volume control. What you could also do if you don't want velocity sensitivity is you can make your shape that does the automatic sub bass removal when the kick plays and just assign that to the place where I now assign the velocity. But in this case, what we need to do is do it like this. And it will still work. Just keep in mind that this is not set to triggered. This is not sent to envelope. This is just connected with the host tempo. Now, if we want to emulate that sub tighter, what we can do is we can set up parameters here, here, and here to the X. And then we'll shape it somewhat like this. A little bit forward, a little bit upward. I believe this shape was a little bit more lower. And then it goes like this. So this just makes that go in earlier. And of course, we have to set this to envelope mode and 16 note as well. And we can play with the shape however we want. Obviously, you would want to listen to it a little bit more. And then finally, we'll do some EQing. Now, what I like to do in my patch is I know I'm going to be turning down around 500 Hertz. That's usually a spot that I don't like the sound of. And I like fairly like wide band like this. And then I want to emphasize the click just a little bit. Something like this at around 8.5K. Now finally we can set up the trick with the distortion. We just set the distortion after the EQ here to make sure that it removes everything. And then we go X shaper, edit A, and then we'll just turn this down all the way. Turn the gain down all the way, and now we have another volume control here. So for this volume control, we're just making sure that it turns off all the way, and we do that with this. And now you get the same bass note every time, and it neatly cuts off after a 16 note. Of course, we want note length in here as well, so what I like to do is double click this, Control C, Enter, and then in all of the macros that need it, we paste 1/16 again. Because that way, they're going to all line up and we can just assign modulation. I believe the value is -12 that you want for all of them. But maybe it's -13, maybe it's -11, something like that. But you want them to all be equal so that they all change from one like length to the other length simultaneously. That's why we want to make sure that they all have the same starting point and all the same amount of modulation. Make sure that you set triplets on if you want your bassline to be able to support triplet notes. And as you can hear now, you get different lengths of notes. Also note that this changes the way that the filter envelope works because it does change the length of the modulation. It also changes the shape of the modulation. You could do some more curve trickery in here, maybe replace the closer macro with some assignments from this macro over here that kind of compensates for that. But honestly, I would need to experiment with that a lot more to be able to do that myself. And I don't think that it's really needed. So that's the whole patch. That's the whole patch recreated. The other one was a little bit nicer, a little bit better set up overall, I would say. You know, it had everything labeled, but in essence, the way that the patch works is the exact same way. Of course, once again, if you don't have my wavetable, which is a requirement for this patch, you can use a different wavetable like the ones from Mine B, or like the one that is in here, the IAMmersive kick, as I said before. With the Mind B ones, one of the things that you have to take into account is that there's no like extra wavetables, it's just one cycle. So you're only going to get this form of processing. The nice thing about my wavetable and the IAMmersive Kick as well to a certain extent is that it is a wavetable, so you can morph between different kind of like settings for the processing. In my case, there was some actual phase shifting going on, which I was continuously increasing. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure how this IAMmersive Kick waveform was made, but I think it will be made in the same way. Just make sure that you always set the phase to right before the click, meaning that in this case, we want the phase to be rightly around here. And we would ideally want to use wave cycles that kind of end with this going to 0. So something like this may work, obviously after removing all of the fundamentals. Now you get the bassline that sounds like this. Obviously this will turn down. You get something like that. And again, you have all of the benefits of a processed bassline without any of the negatives, and you don't have to resample this bass, you don't have to phase align this bass. You just have to mix it in and it will work. Now, as I said, in this video, I didn't explain why we're doing things a certain way. If you really want to know much more about kick and bass design and why certain things are done this way, make sure you check out the full guide that I did a couple of months ago. There you'll find all of the information regarding kick and bass synthesis that I know, all neatly packaged in one single video. Now that's going to be the video. I hope that you enjoyed this one and I hope that you learned something. If you did, let me know by leaving a like and making sure that you're subscribed. That way you support the channel. Another way is to support me through Patreon or by buying my products on my Gumroad page. But that's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.